Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm used to working in tech now, so I'm probably going to have to pace and do my TEDx style interaction. And I welcome interaction. It's very unusual for me to be allowed to speak for 1 hour in my workplace. So this is quite a luxury. I'm very grateful for the invitation. Thank you very much to the Transmedia posse and the Geomedia field for making me very welcome here in Sweden. Also, it's funny, Maren and I met last time in Sweden when we were both visiting fellows at University of Lund. I was at the Pufendorf Institute, which is a name I never get sick of saying. It sounds so fancy, but I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to spend some extended time in Sweden because I am doing some research for Intel while I'm here. And I'll be telling you a little bit about that. I wanted to begin with this image because it's taken from fieldwork in China. I'm going to be speaking quite a lot to this research that I did for the Smart Home team 18 months ago, but having just come from Shanghai this past week here to Sweden, which is why I'm a little jet lagged, I've also got some updated research that I wanted to share with you on that setting, because working in tech, but also having the opportunity to do global comparisons on home space has been very important for me in my development, in thinking about what domestic life entails. But given the conference theme, I wanted to give you a little bit of a personal background. This is me on the beach where I grew up. So I think you've all heard of Australia, which is sometimes called Down Under. So I grew up on an island at the bottom of Australia, Tasmania. So down under, down under. And then this island, where I'm looking out to sea, I'm actually looking towards Antarctica from this beach where I grew up. It's the southernmost beach in Tasmania. It's called Bruny Island. So I'm actually from down under, down under, down under. And this photo was taken the day I decided to move to America. And I think one of the things that's really clear to me, especially when I'm here in Sweden, is that I'm a long way from home. In fact, I think this is the northernmost point I have given an academic talk relative to the parallels in which I'm usually oriented. But when I grew up on this island, my dad was a farmer, and my mother was trained as a teacher. And she actually taught home economics. And this is the story I tell in the opening of my book. It's quite a complex interplay between my relationship with my mother and what I ended up writing in Counterproductive. But one of the things that happens to you when you grow up in country areas in Australia is you're often given these manuals for how to run a home. The one on the left, the 21st birthday cookery book by the Country Women's Association of Tasmania, is one from my personal archive. And I like to start talking about home, and particularly women's role in the home, by drawing attention to this long history of codified expertise that has long been the work of women to pass on through personal and intergenerational networks. And now that I am working from a very different setting, as a post-colonial subject, but in a different empire, you can see there are also English versions, Isabel Beaton, and also the American Woman's Home by the Beecher sisters. This is also something that I begin my book on productivity about, because it's this hidden history of women's expertise as domestic managers that I think has been written out of a lot of the ways that we think about formal instruction for scientific management and efficiency. So that's one definition of home enterprise or domestic work that I want us to have in mind as we go on this journey today. I also wanted to take the opportunity to speak to some of the work I've done in the past. Gillian mentioned some. I want to do a little return or a revision of some of the principles behind Work's Intimacy, which was a book I wrote when I was living in Brisbane, Australia, and a book that really got me very interested in understanding how work is hidden in the home, or how people contribute to its devaluation, whether or not they necessarily acknowledge that. So I'm going to just, like, for the first couple minutes, revisit this study, like literally revisiting the home in work's intimacy. For those of you who don't know it, it's a study of knowledge professionals that I began in 2007. And I was prompted at the time by a set of geographical principles that were being exported by superstar academics of the world of cultural geography, Richard Florida, for example, whose work on creatives and the creative industries was building literally new kinds of institutions in Brisbane at the time. So I was based in a sandstone university, the traditional university in Brisbane, Australia. But our rival, Queensland University of Technology, was building a creative industries faculty. And in many ways, this was a turning point for how cultural studies in Australia was creating different kinds of promises for its students. So creative industries itself as a discourse was something that was influencing the institutions where I was employed and the networks where I was most active. And what I tried to do in the book was to take this situated and located experience of how a cultural geographer's language can have such concrete manifestations and link that to the kinds of work that was happening in that city at that time. A lot of that work was not creative in nature. It was backroom work that was being done to support creative labour. And a lot of that work was also new because one of the things that's clear in this opportunity to love what you do and engage in creative work is that you can have a very intimate relationship to your job. And so what I was struck by was this intersection of vocation and aspiration and identity through labour, and also the freedom and mobility that new technologies were bringing. So this study was looking especially at how debates around work-life balance were being affected by mobile media, mobile devices in particular. And it just so happened, at this historical moment where the study captured not just the beginnings of Facebook, which in itself could have been a study in its own right, and how that affected people over a period of 3 years. The iPhone was also released, so this was, for those of you who are younger in the room, a time before you could get email in your pocket constantly reminding you of what you weren't doing. And then, of course, the study was also affected by bigger financial fluctuations. So actually a number of people in the study lost their jobs in the course of the 3 years that we interviewed them. So in the first instance, I was very set to focus on these findings around women's discounted work, that the flexibility of mobile media devices allowed them to work from home in such a way that they could manage a lot more of their responsibilities in the home space. But what that also obscured, I think, was the structural nature of that experience. A lot of individual women were saying that they felt lucky that they could work from home because they could connect, they could use their laptop, they could stay in touch with the office. But what they were also doing was not really counting that work. They were much more focused on the idea of team etiquette and not letting the team down, even on their days off. And a lot of these women were also working part-time as a way of excusing anything that they weren't on top of or that they hadn't caught up with during those days that they were spending at home. The term I used to describe the combined impact of this more mobile workforce and this ability to judge or be the arbiter of what's a personal or professional obligation was presence bleed. And it's almost like a term from photography where, the image is bleeding off the edge of what you've captured. And I like this image because it makes me think about how, what gets caught in the formal measurement of labour and labour value is often not accurately focused on all the different forms of contribution. But the home that was sort of idealized in this study, I think in retrospect, was one that should have had a kind of sanctity to it, or a border that was sort of firm, that would stop or resist the intrusion of these mobile devices and the kinds of work demands that were coming through it. The other thing that came out of this study was an awareness that the idea of productivity itself as a personal accomplishment or performance is something that's going to be very hard for us to change. That's the story that Counterproductive tries to tell. But these are the sorts of stories that came out of that study. So like just in terms of giving you a concrete example of women who would not count as work, things that were clearly their job. Like answering email is part of everyone's job when you're in a knowledge profession. So to think and to see this as the birth of this experience for a knowledge worker, that they are going to hide in the dawn of the day or the midnight hours to get on top of their email before they get to the formal office each day, ready to do real work is one of the stories that really captivated me. The other one that I like to reflect on is this example of a student's home office. So this was a smaller part of the story of Works Intimacy, but I intentionally interviewed PhD students, interns, and those who were managing the different expectations of their student experience and their potential professional hirers. So students who were obviously here in very cramped environments, simulating the professionalism that would come, or so they thought. So I like this image of the student whose business blazer is on the office chair in this tiny cramped bedroom. There's going to be a lot of tiny cramped spaces in this talk. And this is really how I would summarize the impact of that study. For the purposes of this conference, I think one of the things that's clear now is the mobile nature of the device creates a new kind of attentiveness that people are constantly trying to manage, whether that's seen as compulsion or addiction, which is some people's interpretation of that now, or whether it's a kind of professionalism that people are trying to perform. Either way, the combination of mobile and social media at this time, I think, created a pattern that we are now starting to see some pretty major consequences for. So the idea that you have to project that you are available and that you are on top of things and that you are professional no matter what time, and how that in the Facebook language or the Twitter language or the messaging platforms that all of these workers were starting to have to do on behalf of their organisation in this study meant that they were not only performing their own brand, but they were emblematic or representative of the brands and companies that they worked for. So if I have nothing else to leave you with today, this will be kind of the updated version of what Works Intimacy looks like today. So a very popular viral article in the US a few months ago now focused on how millennials are unable to get organised enough to vote in the election because their to-do list is out of control and they have this kind of paralysis about getting tasks done. But it was a very compelling article because it showed how much millennials have been blamed for not having a strong enough work ethic when actually they have been working extremely hard. It's just that the terms of compensation have changed. I'm going to tell a little bit of that story in my time today, but I think it's worth bearing in mind what I talked about in Works Intimacy was a set of already quite well off and stably employed people in some respects. Since that crash, since 2008, the students that have graduated since I was doing that research have had an even harder time trying to make a living. Some really good research coming out on this now about how young women have been self-branding as video bloggers or as fashion bloggers or as Twitter influencers, and how a lot of this work is very ambiguous in terms of its formalization and its compensation. And here you have an image of a YouTube star who's saying to her fans, "I need a break." And this idea of needing a break from the constant demands of the algorithm and the popularity contest of social media is something that's become really apparent in the States in the last 12 months or so. But I mentioned productivity, and when I moved to the US, one of the things that really struck me working in tech was the extent to which the efficiency mandate of engineering was everywhere. So coming off the back of this project where professionals were starting to feel very self-conscious about their productivity in intimate domestic space, I was also really interested in looking at how tech designers were trying to answer this need for getting things done. The hashtag getting things done arises around this time in response to a book of the same name, which is a productivity manual that was very popular in Silicon Valley. I talk a lot about this in Counterproductive. And this idea that you can get things done by adopting a system and applying the right formula to all of the things that come across your desk is actually it's a quite long-standing concept. It comes to us through the birth of the organisation and the way that the executive was trained to be the efficient manager of time. And this kind of idea that there will always be someone you can delegate to. That is the problem we're wrestling with, right? Because all of those people, happen to be secretaries, happen to be women, happen to be minorities in the organisation. They have all started to get wise to this logic and are no longer fulfilling this function. The virtual secretary is actually now fulfilling this function, which is one reason why people need all these devices. But even in terms of your home life, in the US and especially on the West Coast where I work, this idea that you can delegate the trivia so you can get on with the really important creative work is something that's extremely pervasive. So TaskRabbit is one website that has grown up in the wake of this financial crisis. It's a classic example of the gig economy where the taskers are on call to those who are doing more important work that's obviously more compensated, so it's not worth their time to go into get the drill or to do the mopping of the floors. There's a very famous outrage post about TaskRabbit advertising to professional women that TaskRabbits will mop the floor so that you can do yoga. And so the woman is doing yoga on the same floor that has been mopped by them. Anyway, you get my point. But delegation in home space has a long history. This is what I ended up doing in Counterproductive. I was like, where does this all come from? This idea that I have the power to delegate and the idea that my time should be as efficient as possible. What you're seeing here are a couple of snaps from my reading of 2 books by Christine Frederick, a guru or doyen of household management in this era of domestic science in the home. So in these images, she's enumerating the time required to perform certain tasks. So a baby's bath is 15 minutes, a layer cake is 10 minutes, dusting 5 small rooms daily is 30 minutes, or my favourite, polishing the silver is 40 minutes. So I just actually moved house and I threw out all my silver, and I think it's a reflection of this. So household engineering is the name of this more formalized curriculum that she developed based on Ladies' Home Journal articles that she was writing at the turn of the century. And that's another way of looking at what I'm calling domestic enterprise, the idea that the woman at the head of the household has an efficiency expectation, that she will improve upon her record to beat the timing of that task as it has been set by the consultant in the manual. And in some of these books for housewifery, another great word I get to say now, you see literally an org chart. So working at Intel, this is something that's a very familiar genre to understand who do I actually have to report to, right? So here you have the housewife who is delegating these tasks that have been identified, enumerated, and then apportioned to the servants. Okay, so remember this is a time when wealthy, northeastern ladies in the United States had servants. Some of them also had slaves, which doesn't make it in the diagram, right? But what we're seeing is a way in which the household is being run like a business with a lady boss. Thank you. So, in this history of home management, one thing I have focused on as someone who is now called an engineer is this idea of the household being engineered. And one of the first female engineers to influence this domestic science realm and also formalize it in consulting for companies is Lillian Gilbreth. So you may have heard of the film or the book Cheaper by the Dozen. Lillian Gilbreth was the wife, the mother of the dozen. And she and her husband Frank were management consultants at the turn of the century. Frank unfortunately passed away early, and Lillian took over as the expert consulting to business. She was also someone very interested in ergonomics. Some think that Frank had some injuries which made her interested in designing for veterans and those who are disabled in the home. So a lot of her inventions, like the pedal bin in the household or in the kitchen, which she designed so you only need to use your foot and not get your hands dirty touching the bin, right? Thinking about women who are multitasking in the home. And this prototype for IBM that she did, which is a home management desk with all the files and drawers that you need to organise the household work. We're going to be hearing about more of this from Magnus later today, I think. But the enterprise here, the house being ordered, and the idea of efficiency that we inherit from the same advisors that were building the case for scientific management in industry. And Christine Frederick, as I mentioned, she and Lillian both had a lot to say about reducing the housewife's steps. And what you're seeing in the pictures there are the ways in which the kitchen could be redesigned for more optimal space utilisation and minimising the number of movements that the housewife is making, moving between sinks and bench and delivering the meals. So I did all of this reading, of course, while I was working for Intel in the smart home team, and I was really struck by some of the market research that we found, which showed that in spite of the fact that nothing has really changed about women's representation in doing the domestic work, they saw no real interest in buying smart home devices because it was just not seen as relevant to this kind of labour that was taking place in the home. So those who did not own or did not plan to own, I noticed was higher for women, and nobody had noticed this, of course, at the time when I was doing this work. So when I was in this role, I put together a lot of the statistics on why are we not having this conversation about women working? Because there's obviously a lot of trends to take women's work outside of the home. And that expertise, I guess, that I was pointing to, that was codified in the manuals and the scientific experts like Christine Frederick and Lillian Gilbreth, were not so relevant to a new kind of generation. So in sum, what I was doing in that part of the research I was doing in the smart home was to try and really push the engineers to think differently. If you had women in charge of this business, what would the smart home look like? And then as a joke, I would say maybe it would all be pink. But what we ended up doing was I did a Tech Fest talk on this topic in Portland, and I was lucky enough to be partnered with Nellie Bowles from the New York Times to talk about this problem of smart home technology being designed mostly by men. So she ended up writing a whole article about the incidence of domestic violence in the adoption of smart technologies in the home. This article went viral. It was just a huge, huge story. Obviously, I was not necessarily in a lot of good standing with Intel at the time because it's the most highly cited article on smart home technology with Intel in the search terms that's ever been published, but it's all about what are the threats to women in the home if they don't understand how the smart technology has been installed or how to use it or who has access to their home. So something I'll return to is what happens when the home itself is a site of threat. At exactly the same time as this conference this week, we've had a paper on this topic presented at CHI, the Computer Human Interaction Conference happening in Glasgow as well. So if you want to see a little bit more of the academic conversation about women in the smart home and gender technology. We just won an award for this paper this very week, so happy story in some ways. I now want to turn to explicitly working from home. Some of you may have seen this famous clip of a man in his home office giving a live interview on BBC News, who is interrupted by his daughter coming in. You can see in the background with the little yellow jumper. He's live on TV at the time, and he tries to, I won't show you the clip, but he tries to just push her out of the way. Very explicit example, right, of the home trying to be hidden when someone is trying to be professional. I'm constantly thinking about what working from home actually looks like. And I came across this. This is my light relief moment as I transition to this fantastic cartoonist who's showing, I think, what working from home really looks like. So the college sweatshirt I've had for 10 years, 2 different socks, obviously unshaved legs if you're a woman, weird bun that holds my bangs back, no bra. It just goes on. So like it's a very nice way of thinking about the juxtaposition of that highly professional image that one likes to project through their online presence and through their articulate professional work, but then what's really going on behind the scenes. And I'm obviously very interested in the behind the scenes of these women who are increasingly having to work from home because they're not getting workplaces. My favourite is the Skype conference look, where she's like, earrings even. Okay, so I'll leave that with you. I'm now going to transition a little to the fieldwork that I've been doing for Intel, because while I was involved in all that archive work, I was also managing a whole bunch of research we were doing for Intel looking at this topic of working from home. I can talk about some of these, but there are 3 studies we've done in the last year on working from home, because I really wanted to update Works Intimacy's findings for this next generation. So we did work in Europe, we did work in the US, and we did work in Shanghai, in China. So that's what I'm going to focus on now. And for those of you who are Chinese, I apologize. This is going to be not news to you. But I hope it's going to be important for our conversation for the rest of the day. So when we did the work in Shanghai, last time I went, this is kind of the context. We kind of we spent a lot of time in cabs and in traffic in the efforts to find our participants. And I want to be clear that this is not China, this is Shanghai. And this is only a very small part of Shanghai, because Shanghai is not necessarily what we should take as representative of all China, just like Silicon Valley is not how we should represent all of America. These are the people that we interviewed. I don't usually like to show people's faces, so if you would mind not taking photos of faces, but I wanted to show you the home sizes, like this actual square feet, or square meters in this case, of the people that we interviewed, because so much of the history of thinking about the home theoretically, and I think in the technology industry, is based on this wonderful idea of suburban domesticity. So I'm just giving you a brief indication there of how small these homes are. And given the conversation yesterday, I wanted to focus a little bit on what it's like to be at home online. So if you go to urban China right now, it's very hard to see anybody's eyes, because people are just constantly on their phone. And there's just not a lot of reciprocal eye contact, shall we say. And I think that's because connectivity is creating a sense of home. We have to think about the transformation that's happened in China over the last couple of decades, where so many people are moving into the city for work, but also are enjoying this ability to discover a whole media landscape in doing so. And also very reliant on media technologies to navigate a vast urban space that has been built very quickly. Now, Shanghai is a little unique here. I mean, we've often been recruiting for Shanghainese people. I'll tell you why. But the thing that's really interesting about them is, in this case, it doesn't matter where the domestic partner is, for example, when this woman is playing her game, because being in the game is what makes her feel at home. So online life is creating a sense of home. And one of the things that, to refer to Maran's work yesterday on ontological security, I think we need to acknowledge that for a number of people, we're seeing a sense of calm and security being created by this ongoing connectivity. So what you'll also see in urban locations in China are these power banks that you can pick up if you're at a restaurant or if you're out shopping and you're running out of battery. Like, this anxiety of having your battery run out on your phone is being supported by different kinds of businesses. So when I'm without the phone, I feel uncomfortable. And one of the reasons people are uncomfortable is that the phone has largely been replaced, or has replaced, the wallet and certainly the credit card. WeChat is being used for so much of everyday life. The ways in which it is integrated with payment systems is it's brilliant and extremely convenient. And there are lots of different ways that people describe their relationship with WeChat as different than other platforms, partly because it is this comprehensive way of being in the world in China. So I'm going to give you a little bit more of this fieldwork material, partly because I think it is profound that some of the people that we've interviewed, they're falling asleep with their phone in their hand, and it's the first thing that they have on when they wake up. This woman we interviewed wouldn't put a password on her phone because that would slow her down. So I think that's just one of the anecdotes that I bring back from fieldwork to the engineers to say, yeah, you're worried about privacy, but you're worried about it from a certain point of view, from an American's point of view. And then there are certain ways in which the experience and the sense of belonging and attention and familiarity that comes with the connectivity is creating different kinds of priorities for people. The other thing we noticed, this woman was fantastic in this regard, was people have like more than one phone. I mean, this woman, I think she had 7 phones for different reasons, right? So depending on what the plan is, depending on when she first got the phone, and she doesn't want to lose that number because those are friends from her real home, which one's best for WeChat, which one's best for live streaming, which one's going to make my face look better. These are all the different reasons that people have phones. And the thing that's also interesting, I guess sad in some ways for the PC business, which is where I work at Intel, is that everything happens on the phone. There's no need to grow up to get a PC because the sophistication of what's happening on the phones is incredible. So these are some of the raw notes that we brought back from the field. And the thing that I guess is also important to bear out is that when we talk about social media in Western contexts, we're often talking about Facebook or Twitter. Remember that these are not allowed, and a lot of Western sites have heavily censored content. So what WeChat has managed to do is to bring together this sort of smorgasbord of utilities as well as pleasures in the one app. That's why it's now being called a mega app or a platform in its own right, and to the extent that it may be rivaling operating systems as the reason why people are buying phones. Now, the reason I wanted to tell you the story about WeChat is its relation to the domestic. So, we met a number of people who I think are emblematic of what I've been trying to say about household enterprise and logistics. So, a couple of these stories, just to give you some real examples of how people are managing the to and fro of goods, the coming and going of childcare, and also in terms of the payments, the ways in which the need to leave the home is going away. So a number of the services that people are using will bring goods directly to the house. So you have a whole bunch of bikes with huge parcels coming in every day, delivering to lockers and delivering to the door. And it does really question the idea of whether you need to ever go anywhere to go to work or to have an income. So Mizuki here is a young woman who does a lot of the utilities and communications work for her family at home. She's basically running a business from the apartment, right? So what you're seeing here are the shoes that she is reselling. And this was something that we saw pretty commonly, that people were buying in bulk, a whole bunch of goods from discount platforms, and then reselling and using personal networks to do so. So think about what it would mean to bring in all of this inventory to your house: clothes, makeup, appliances, and clearly this month it's shoes. We also met people who are mobilizing these platforms to make use of their assets in new ways. So even though this person didn't have Shanghai plates, could rent out his car, could also rent out apartments using his house as an asset to make new forms of income. So when you're thinking about the sharing economy in your geography, this is one of the ways that the metropolitan location translates that slightly differently in China. Because obviously not everyone is allowed to have a car in China. So here what you're doing is making the best out of that situation if you happen to have one, even if you can't drive it. And here is one of the stories I really wanted to focus on, given what I was talking about with the lady boss going way back in history. So Cindy was unique in that she had 2 children, quite a wealthy family, I think it's fair to say. She also had her own successful startup business, arranging Chinese women to get IVF treatment in the States. And one of the things that made her life possible was that she had nannies. So 2 nannies, a cook and a maid, and a chauffeur. Now that in itself is impressive, but the other thing that she had was a WeChat group for her children. So her children were usually available through video feed, through these 7 cameras that she had throughout the house. And all of the rooms in the house, aside from the bathroom, were visible through these security cameras. And the security cameras were also in the kids' rooms, so the nannies would sleep with the children and would be on video all that time. So what you're seeing here is one of the profiles we did for each of the people we interviewed. It's a breakdown of what technology they owned, and also a way of representing their online life, their online network. I want to show you that just as a methodological footnote, but also to say, like, this is what home looks like on WeChat for this person. The thing that I guess I'm trying to draw attention to here is that the way that care and domestic space is being mediated here is really interesting. Some might find it disturbing. So by contrast, I wanted to give you some happier examples of how childcare is taking place. So the Alexa you may be familiar with, or Google Home. This is the Ding Dong voice assistant, Ding Dong Ling Long. So in China, these are becoming popular partly because they're really fun, like everyone's finding for playing music. And we found a number of parents who were using these voice assistants largely because it was an easier way of playing lullabies for their children. And you could move it, this one is not attached to power, so you could move it from room to room. And this is another example, which, like, it's always great to be able to bring this kind of quote back from fieldwork to tell the engineers. When you put Ding Dong in your bedroom, it's like a close friend. You talk to it, it will make you relax by playing a song. It's not as intimate as my besties, but it is a close friend. So here, the mother is showing us how she uses the Ding Dong to put on the song as she rocks her baby to sleep. So thinking again of how we heard Lillian Gilbreth designing the pedal bin in the kitchen for the mother that wanted to have her hands free. Here's another example of how the smart home technology is allowing that more intimate bond. Other examples we saw, international city, of course, Shanghai. So we interviewed people who were using Alexa on purpose to teach their children English in the home. So a couple from Singapore were using Amazon on purpose in English. And others, of course, were making use of the integration of how the smart home device could control lighting, television, etc. So the other day I interviewed a gamer who had automated his screen to turn off on his desktop if he'd forgotten to turn it off and he was in bed. So I was like, maybe not the most important thing that you need to automate, and given the size of the apartment, it's probably something you could have gotten up and done from your bed, but that is the magic of efficiency. And just in terms of the care work of the camera, I also wanted to draw attention to this one. So we found a lot of young women who were installing cameras to look after their elderly parents while they were out at work or out shopping. This camera, you can sort of see maybe the blue circle. I'm trying to show you how it's in the background of this apartment. It's working as a security camera to see if anyone comes inside the front door there, which is to the right. But she's also she's found a way to hack it so that she can talk through it when she's out of the house. And her parents are not very mobile, so she can get them a message if she wants to. Thank you. Okay. So these are some of the ways that I think it's important to have some context to see why people are buying the technology. So there are complex ways that people are making judgments about privacy and intimacy and what's an appropriate place to put the camera. So Mr. Lee had it inside the home, but then he was worried about the data going to the wrong places with his baby daughter, so now the camera is outside the home. And these are the nanny cams I was mentioning, where on the baby's cradle you're keeping an eye on the baby, but you're also keeping an eye on the nanny. It's interesting to see it, because it's really happening, and at the same time, what would we read this as telling us? I think one of the things I've tried to interpret this as doing is showing the index of care in the home. So one of the other things that's really common is people getting cameras to watch their pets when they're not at home. So it's like whether there's a relationship happening between surveillance and absence, and so it's something I thought would be worth us talking about in the context of this conference. Just to make the point, there's a very different kind of surveillance to the ubiquitous surveillance in the external environment from the home in urban China, where neighbourhoods and apartment complexes that you visit will have physical barriers and security guards allowing you in or not, and just in general the amount of surveillance is quite high. So just some thoughts to wrap up this section. I think it's important to understand that homes have interesting functions for some of these participants that we mentioned. The reason we ended up calling this study the distributed home study was to draw attention to the ways in which the home as an asset was being used by the family across the city and across the different stages of people's lives. So there would be intricate ways in which the family would discuss who would live in which apartment at what time of their life, and also some very interesting relationships to the impermanency of home, because Shanghai is always redeveloping and it's demolishing homes, and sometimes you don't get a say in that, right? So you have to be prepared and have a contingency plan and be okay with that. People buying real estate in international locations are partly securing a defense against that. The other thing I think is really interesting from a Western point of view is the way in which extended family become part of the resourcing of the home. So this woman that we interviewed had a baby that she would look after in her own home, but then when she wanted to work from home, like she was doing remote work for her professional job, she would go to her parents' house to work from home. So she would be in her childhood bedroom, which is this photo here, and she would be doing her conference calls from that desk while her baby was in the room next door with her parents. So she was working from home, pretending to her baby that she was going to work, but she was just in the next room. So very clever and very interesting way in which the family stays together, but the mother is able to continue to bring in some extra income. And then finally, I think that this idea of the home being the place where this goods circulation happens, whether it's your own acquisition, right, or whether it's a way in which you're building yourself up for the future that you hope for. This woman was showing us her luxury goods, but also in terms of this relationship to the logistics of supply in China, that's very common. And this way in which the marketplace like Taobao is able to give you these incredible amounts of goods and deliver them to your door is creating different kinds of storage practices that in a different setting might look like hoarding, right, if you're in an American reality show, but in a Shanghainese apartment, it's very common. So this is the closest we came to having like a similar relationship, I think, to the home space. When we met this woman to interview her, she had just stayed up all night for 11/11, which is the big shopping event in China each year. And she was still in her pajamas, and it just seemed like a really great symbol of what her life is like when she is at home. She gets her comfy clothes on, she sits on the couch, she watches this video content, and she's able to, you know, be online and have all these services at her fingertips through WeChat. That may be a harbinger of what we're going to see in the US as well. But strangely, you know, we don't have anything like that infrastructure in place to allow that convenience and delivery on demand, because it's spatially so much different. Okay, the last thing I wanted to mention is inspired by some of this work in Asia, but also thinking back on the idea of virtual versus real work online. So there's been a number of recent publications and republications of work looking at how people's personality or their taste or their skills creates a new line of income for people who are prepared to really push that level of intimacy and sharing to a new level. So here I wanted to draw attention to something that is very new in our research that I think is worth contemplating, just in terms of that bigger history of what people are doing at home that creates a sense of income or a new kind of mobility that the virtual is allowing. And I'm inspired by, I mentioned Crystal Abedin in the last slide, but her reading of influences, and this is an example of one of the idols that you can watch a whole documentary about, which is incredibly compelling, of women who are broadcasting themselves online to their fan base for different forms of subscription. So last week I interviewed a live streamer to try and get some more concrete details of how this works for her. And often these are women who are streaming from home. Some of them are now formalizing their relationship to agents to be able to have access to studios to simulate an intimate environment if they don't have the space to stream from home like this woman is. So we just finished a research report which is more US based, but I just thought it was worth giving you a flavour of the kinds of things that people are streaming. And here my attempt is really to bring things back to the domestic and sort of see how these skills and expertise that I started talking about at the beginning of women's work in the home is now being optimized for broadcast. Okay, so what you're looking at here, again, trying not to reveal identities, but the participants in this study of live streamers that we just finished, and a number of them are engaged in classically feminine arts, like putting on makeup. You know, makeup instruction, makeup videos are how-to videos that are off the charts popular, right, on YouTube. The other ones that are very popular seem to be cooking broadcasts. Now in Asia, there's a very big phenomenon of eating broadcasts, the mukbang videos, where people are consuming food for your pleasure and mutual enjoyment. In these examples, we didn't look at the eaters, we looked at the cooks, and the cooking broadcasters that are now starting to set up very elaborate cameras in their kitchens in order to show you how to cook what they're doing. I'll just give you a couple of examples of that, and then we can wrap things up. So this is a streamer who's focused on showing, the behind the scenes of the kinds of work that he does as a builder of physical models. So somebody who, if you look at the numbers, has over 65,000 people following his stream. He's one of the, we met a couple of people who actually influenced the platform Twitch, which is where these broadcasts are hosted, to change their categories from being only, so originally Twitch was designed to broadcast games live for an audience, so you can see how somebody is playing a game. The extension now with these more creative arts is for people to be broadcasting how they're doing the thing that they're very skilled at. So it's a little bit like the crossover between the how-to video that YouTube made popular, but also the self-help genre of instruction and enlisting you in a kind of art form that you may also learn how to practice. So again, like these are the raw notes from the field, but we usually, as a tech company, want to know how is this performance being choreographed? And so this guy's invested in all of these different, very complex and pointed forms of lighting and microphones and cameras, so he can see what is being seen on the stream while he's streaming. He's also developed a harmonica stand for his camera. So that's what you're looking at. He's not playing a harmonica. That is a camera on a harmonica stand photographing what he's doing, so that the person watching can get the right level of intimacy. And these are the classic cooks who are setting up their kitchens as studios, right? Again, one of the things that is interesting here is that it's not really authentic because you've got these huge lights being brought into the kitchen, and it's an ongoing debate about live streaming and vlogging in particular about how authentic is it if your setup is this elaborate, And so just like the Chinese girls who are live streaming we interviewed want to have the right kind of camera to get the right kind of airbrushing effects on their face. Again, this lighting is to optimize the look of the location as well as the star of the show. So fewer followers in this case, but interesting example of, if you remember, I was pointing to the student and the intern back in Works Intimacy, where people are bringing together multiple gigs in order to make an income that would be anything like the same amount of income that a middle-class person was earning pre-2008. We're seeing a whole lot of young people now streaming these sorts of side hustles or passion projects as a way to make it big, or as a way to make supplementary income from the thing that they already like to do. So this one is another example of that type, where she is a cooking streamer who has several small businesses that make up her income. Dog sitting, house sitting, and now the cooking stream, right? So fewer followers, but still like not insubstantial. Like I would be nervous broadcasting to 1,000 people every day. So the thing that I guess I wanted to draw out here too, just in terms of like that logistics of the household and how these practices are really pushing on the idea of what is happening in the home. One of the things that she struggles with is this problem of shipping and tracking orders. Like she is running an enterprise from her home, but none of these services are like necessarily imagined for this kind of user or this kind of business. So very cutting edge, and I just thought it would be fun to show you some of these examples. The person who had the most followers here is a makeup artist and hairdresser with a certain kind of specialization. So this is what I mean about the return to the guild or the sponsor, where 441,000 people are subscribed to her YouTube channel so that they can get instruction on how to do authentic, traditional makeup for an Indian wedding. Again, great setup in the home, very good for Intel, seeing all these computers, and the right kinds of computers, Dell. But anyway, that's just a little glimpse of what I think is coming in the future in terms of how people are making use of the home, and also making use of those perhaps more feminine expertise and specialist skills that previous ideas of money making in the home may not have enabled without technology. So my final kind of thoughts here were based on the fieldwork that I've just been doing, wondering whether this propensity to live stream, and I wanted to give the longer example of China today to think about, you know, some of the hypotheses that are coming out about why people are feeling the need to broadcast themselves in quite this way. So obviously in China there's been a historical policy of a one-child policy for families, and some commentators are arguing that live streaming is a way of making up for a lack of broader community, and particularly within an urban environment where things feel very overwhelming, to be able to broadcast to your followers, to your subscribers, can be comforting, can be a way of feeling that sense of recognition that Maren was talking about yesterday. And especially at a time when, yes, if you walk down the street, everybody is looking at their phone and there is not a lot of face-to-face intimacy, being able to tune in to somebody who you get to know through a stream is a way of offsetting loneliness, and perhaps also for the streamer. One woman who met us last week was quite shy in meeting us. She wanted to meet us in public because she didn't know if we were legitimate researchers. You know, she's obviously very cautious about her location as a streamer because some of her fans are quite obsessed with her. So she's a 23-year-old girl who's only been in Shanghai for a year. She streams to a majority middle-aged male audience. And the way that they show their love for her is by buying her virtual gifts. So they buy her flowers on Valentine's Day. They buy her a Lamborghini as a virtual gift. This is the best one you can get, by the way. So her work there is to make those men feel close to her, but in a very studied way. So she will only talk about certain kinds of things, but the more she streams, the more she creates these connections with her patrons. And I do think that is one of the interesting trends to watch when it comes to what's going on in domestic broadcasts and some of the challenges of this new way of making an income stream. Because obviously that kind of relationship is one that may make us feel a little uncomfortable. And certainly if you watch that Idol documentary I mentioned, it can be quite concerning. But the broader context is this condition of loneliness, that people are looking for different ways to connect, and the platforms are enabling that. So this was her showing us what she does on her phone last week. I'm going to wrap up, and I'm just going to try and summarize what I've walked you through in terms of my own thinking on what's changed about the home. I think what I was looking at early on in my career and looking at works intimacy as a project was a kind of outrage, that there wasn't enough labour politics going on when we were introducing mobile devices to the workplace, and that the home should be protected from the intrusions of commercial obligation. I also, made a few assumptions. I think that the home was a safe place for people to retreat to from work. I think I should have known better about that because, as I alluded to in some of the smart home research on domestic violence in particular, the home has not always been a safe space for women, and it's not necessarily ever been a leisure space for women. So why would I go demanding that at a time when just because there's a new technology released, that should change? So the summary, and thanks for your attention all this time, is that the home has always required the exchange of intimacy for rewards. I guess the conversation I wanted to have with you is, how do we feel about that right now? That's where I'm going to end. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks so much, Melissa. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm sure there's loads of questions. In theory, we have about 15 minutes, but I'm sure we can overrun to keep the discussion going. And maybe we could start with that question Melissa posed us.
It's always good to end with a question that you can answer.
Rewarding intimacies.
someone's very vocal. What do you want to say? Can you translate?
Thank you very much. That is fascinating
Good.
research, especially when you mention a lot of empirical data from Shanghai. It's much more accessible for me,
Good.
particularly. Well, she's from Shanghai, particularly.
Well,
I'm
we
not
need
from
to talk
Shanghai.
about chat
Yes.
videos. I know that.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with you that what we experienced with this kind of smart home and how people's home domestic experiences changed through this idea and the technology of smart home. Instead of saying it's a transformation or kind of a big change, we actually need to link what is happening now to something actually always continuous happening. I agree with that, but I still want to ask, there must be something special for this particular period, driven by internet, kind of for this. Apart from this continuity of this domesticity and women's position in the domestic space, what is that something special about what is happening now? If you compare the current, what is happening
Yes.
now, and then the historical kind of moment.
One company owns all the data. One company is allowing this to happen in such a way that it becomes irresistible for people to join the digital platform. I'm talking about WeChat in general, but between Alibaba and Tencent in China, we have a similar situation in the US with Facebook, Google, and Amazon. What in your polite terms, what is special, but what I would say is what is outrageous, is that people's ordinary practices have become monetized. So they are now transactions happening on digital platforms that individuals don't own and cannot get access to. And so that is a very important point that I didn't emphasize enough, as I assumed it would come up in questions. The fact that, if you are not Chinese and you go to Shanghai now, it is very hard for you to participate in public interactions because you cannot pay with WeChat, or you have to be extremely detail oriented in order to figure out how to get your bank account linked in order to pay. And it's a cashless society. Everyone is using their mobile phones to do basic things. What concerns me, and what is special about this in the Chinese context too, is that the government is now preparing this campaign around social credit scoring based on your activity on these platforms. So of course, okay, sorry, that's very shocking. Shocking news for you. I can see your face, and it is not that different to how credit scores have always worked in other cultures, but at the same time, to the extent that you can be monitored to the level of your location and also your purchases. I think this is what is special about now. People do not have a right of reply to this kind of credit rating system. And just in the last couple of weeks, Facebook have announced how they are trying to integrate payments on their platform. So this is part of what's happening that does make us, I think, highly conscious of the terms on which our intimacy is being transacted.
Hi, thanks for really a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
As I look at these assumptions about the home, it occurs to me that your previous assumptions are perhaps male assumptions about the home, and these are perhaps female assumptions about the home. And I'm wondering about other kinds of assumptions about the home that might come from different perspectives. There are also kind of the assumptions from a rich home, as you pointed out in your original work. Somebody who has servants come home, and I'm seeing Mr. Banks from Mary Poppins. But that. What are the assumptions that we might make from a poor home?
Yeah.
What are the assumptions that we might make from a marginalized home, which would, in turn, just as the female assumptions, shed new light on some of the potential dangers and exploitations of these types of technologies? I wondered if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and also brings to mind the Hannah Arendt quote from yesterday. I think that the home space is this private retreat, the four walls where you can separate yourself from the rabble of the terrible, uncontrollable world out there. And I think a couple of things on that point. Working in tech, one of the things that worries me a lot is the amount of literacy that is assumed that ordinary people have about what it means to be online and enjoying some of these platform features. And this did come up a little bit yesterday in the discussion about Facebook for the homeless or houseless. I wonder how much of a responsibility tech companies will need to have, especially in the forthcoming election in the United States, to better equip citizens and how their data is being used. And I say that in relation to wealth because I think one of the things that's very clear in the US is that education is not being invested in, but entertainment is. And the ways that media and tech companies are now having to create new kinds of alliances because tech companies have realized that their business model has been trading off raiding the ways that citizens were informed in the past, by single-handedly destroying journalism as a profession, for example. The things I'm trying to touch on here are to do with the combination of education and poverty that in the US in particular strikes me as almost an insurmountable challenge. And to force people, as we heard yesterday, to use online platforms even to access benefits when they are not able to get employed seems to me perpetuating the same problem. So what I'm kind of looking to academia for in many ways is a kind of alliance when it comes to recognizing that education is going to be critical to enabling different forms of income in future, because if you're a gig worker dependent on a platform and sleeping in your car outside of San Francisco because you can't afford to live there, but you can make money driving people around it, that's one of the things that's happening on the West Coast now, is that those who can't even afford to live in the city are taking gig work and sort of sleeping in these transit zones in the perimeter of the city to be prepared for binge and surge demand for their work. So very much like Sarah Sharma's work has talked about those periods of waiting and being on call. I think that relationship to time is also one of the ways that poverty is being experienced now, and that's why it's a really big theme at this conference, I think, that idea of dwelling and waiting with or without a home. I can say more, but if there are more questions, I don't know.
Maren had a question, and then there's someone in the chat.
Maren, you can go first. Okay. Fabulous, and loads of things I would want to ask, but I'll stick to one. Have you thought about the unsmart home?
Have I ever? Yes. It's quite convenient that I am no longer working in the smart home team. I didn't really tell the end of that story. But when I was getting on stage for that talk with Nellie Bowles at TechFest, where we were going to talk about the smart home, she asked me this question as well. She said, along those lines, she said, what if I don't want my house to be smart? And I said, I don't really either, you know, but have you got Facebook on your phone? Because I detected in her hesitation that she didn't want to have a camera. She didn't want to have surveillance. She didn't want the sensors. So often what we're talking about with smart home technology is sensor data or sensor devices tracking people in the home. So I said to her, you've got a mobile phone. You've got a mobile phone right there. Do you know whether it's recording you? Do you know whether that camera's activated? Have you individually unselected all of the ways that you're being tracked right now? What difference does it make if it's the home or if it's here? How literate are you in what is already being done with your traces? And to me, that's one of the big questions, right? Is it's sort of like, what is this artificial boundary we think that we have now when it comes to what's intimate and protected and what's already game? So, in some ways, I don't think we have a choice in terms of how much is already known about us if we are using any device. So you may already have a smart home.
So I think we have two more questions. So there's somebody right at the back row there.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for the great talk. We were on the bus yesterday. Actually, I had a power bank in my bag.
Oh,
and
you
I was very
did?
anxious because I have two phones, one for online, one for talking to my friends.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm coming from the Philippines and as from the Asian Pacific side, wherein I'm actually a home professional. I've been working as a photographer since 2004. We have one of the weirdest requests was to how to load a film camera. I give out film cameras to my students and inspired by visual research methods. When I give these out in the past 2 years, they don't actually have an idea of how to load film cameras anymore. Well, my siblings are also translocated time workers. One is from works with Ernst and Young in Australia, and the other one is a graphic designer in Old Navy and Tumblr in the States. We don't have local clients. We have international clients. And that in itself is where the conflict comes in. Our own tax department doesn't know how to tax international labor or even how to tax the gifts that we receive, let's say, to promote, to have content. And the industry in the Philippines is that there are blogger events to produce content for the other content producers. You share the same space, document the same event, and then you publish, you post your own YouTube channel on different channels itself. But what I've noticed is that in our country, there's a lack of male content. It's mostly from mom bloggers, like how do you manage your own space, domestic spaces, how to do makeup in spite of having a baby on one hand,
Oh, wow.
and being the athleisure mom, working out with a baby sleeping in the background. So these are things that when presented today, I was like, I know where this is coming from, and
Yes.
I've been guilty as well as one of those creating that kind of content. One, as a photographer, we try to simulate what it's like during the day by placing curtain lights beside a dark space to reproduce what it's like during in the morning, but you're actually shooting at night when the kid is asleep.
Oh, we've got some good technology for you coming out soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I'd like just sharing from our own perspective as well. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. I think that was very enlightening for everyone to hear.
Well, thanks very much for a great talk. I have a very simple question concerning your rich field work, because especially when you were showing this picture of this woman not showing her face in the picture, but just sort of showing you what she was doing, and this attempt to not be too upfront with meeting you.
Yeah.
One of the questions was whether in this fieldwork you also explicitly asked or heard about this sort of the boundaries of this kind of going live, and
Yeah.
so what are the times, what are the spaces, or what are the activities that people maybe consciously not show, because it's such a, I mean, especially that picture of that bedroom,
Yeah.
such a small space
Yeah.
to be in, to be sort of showing yourself in a very intimate setting. And I was just wondering whether you had more about this sort of the boundaries of this intimacy. So what is too intimate to be shown, or what is there a particular way of doing it?
So it's a kind of combination, I think, of the sitting room etiquette of maybe the 17th or 18th century, where women were kind of on display to make polite conversation with the visiting guests, and they needed to have read enough good novels or just enough awareness of the news, but not too much, because that would be too intellectual, right? So a certain kind of politesse, and this individual we interviewed mentioned that part of her regime for preparing for a broadcast was to read the news and to make sure that she had songs, she was a singer, she have songs ready that would delight the audience and that she knew that they already liked. So you'll also see the preparation regime being, going through what's happening on the equivalent of TikTok and seeing what songs are popular, so that you know how to cast yourself for that day. But I think the other part of it that became very clear is that there are certain kinds of help required if you get too popular. So I didn't mention this, but she in particular had a friend, a devoted fan who was available for her when things were a little too hectic in her feed and she needed somebody to manage the comments. So another thing we're trying to work out in the tech interpretation of this for how we will be using AI in future on platforms is how can I simulate the publicist or the manager's role in the comments thread, so that if something is getting a little too uncouth or something is inappropriate, it can be flagged automatically so the streamer doesn't get distracted while streaming. And I think the way she in particular is drawing boundaries, but I think it's common across streamers, is to say, I will be available for you for the stream, but they have very elaborate rules about who they will talk to in any other format. So she is only, I think she said she had 10 donors that she will be friends with on WeChat, so they have a more direct relationship with her, but only 10. And she was very clear that this is unusual of all the thousands. So they would have to be ones that she had decided were buying her enough Lamborghinis, or who were trustworthy enough to have that extra level of attention. So very much like an agent who's attentive to the high-profile clients, but nothing very personal. She was very clear in her case that she only sang songs that she knew her fans would like. She wouldn't, even though she wanted to be a singer, she wanted to record a demo and be a star, she wouldn't sing her own songs because they were too melancholy and she didn't think her fans would understand. So it was clear then that she was making a deliberate effort to perform and be happy and cute and interesting in the language of Sian Nai, but also directly from this streamer. She knew the content that would sell.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure there are lots more questions, but I think we have run out of time. Lunch is waiting. So I have a couple of requests from the conference organisers, one of which is to remind you, perhaps while you're over lunch, there's an experimental film running on a screen in the lunch hall called Father's Footsteps, so do perhaps pause and go take a look at that. But also I've been